Close your eyes and let your mind drift back through the mists of time, back 28 centuries, to the rolling hills of central Italy. Here, along the winding banks of the Tiber River, a story began that would reshape the entire world. This is the complete tale of Rome, from its humble beginnings as a collection of mud brick huts to its transformation into the greatest empire the world has ever known, and ultimately to its gradual decline and fall. Let the weight of the day fade away as we journey together through the epic sweep of Roman history. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort as we explore the rise of kings, the birth of a republic, the conquest of nations, and the glory of an empire that stretched from the foggy moors of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt. Our story begins in the 8th century before Christ, in a time when Greece was already ancient, when the pharaohs still ruled Egypt, and when most of Europe remained cloaked in the shadows of prehistory. The Italian peninsula was home to various tribes: the Etruscans in the north, Greek colonists along the southern coasts, and scattered throughout the central regions, numerous Latin-speaking peoples living in small hilltop settlements. Legend tells us that Rome's founding involved twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned as infants and suckled by a she-wolf before being discovered by a shepherd. While archaeologists have found no evidence of this mythical tale, what they have uncovered tells an equally fascinating story of gradual settlement and growth. The actual founding of Rome likely occurred around 753 BCE, not through a single dramatic moment, but through the slow merger of several small villages built on the famous 7 hills: the Palatine, Aventine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, and Celian. These early Romans were farmers and herders, living in simple thatch-roof dwellings, scratching out a living from the fertile but sometimes flood-prone land along the Tiber. Archaeological evidence reveals that these early settlements were influenced by their more sophisticated neighbors, particularly the Etruscans to the north. The Etruscans were master engineers, artists, and traders who had developed complex urban centers, elaborate drainage systems, and sophisticated religious practices. From them, the Romans learned the arts of construction, urban planning, and governance. The earliest Romans lived under a monarchy ruled by 7 legendary kings whose reigns spanned nearly 2.5 centuries. The first of these, Romulus, himself, according to tradition, established many of the basic institutions that would define Roman society for generations to come. He created the Senate, originally an advisory council of elder statesmen, and divided the population into 2 basic classes: the patricians, who were the wealthy landowners and nobles, and the plebeians, who comprised the common citizens, farmers, and craftsmen. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was remembered as the great lawgiver and religious reformer. Unlike his predecessor, Numa was said to be a man of peace who established many of Rome's religious festivals, built temples, and created the college of priests that would oversee the city's spiritual life. His reign was viewed as a golden age of prosperity and moral virtue. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, returned Rome to its warlike nature, conquering the nearby city of Alba Longa and forcibly relocating its population to Rome. This pattern of conquest and integration would become a defining characteristic of Roman expansion throughout their history. Ancus Marcius, the fourth king, continued the work of expansion while also focusing on infrastructure. He built the first bridge across the Tiber, established the port city of Ostia at the river's mouth, and constructed the Mamertine prison, which still stands in Rome today. The fifth king, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, was himself of Etruscan origin, highlighting the cultural exchange between these neighboring peoples. He initiated major construction projects, including the draining of the marshy valley that would become the Roman Forum, and began work on the Great Circus Maximus, which would eventually seat over 250,000 spectators for chariot races and other spectacles. Servius Tullius, the sixth king, implemented crucial military and social reforms. He reorganized the army based on wealth rather than birth, created the first census system to count citizens and their property, and built the first defensive walls around the city. His reforms laid the groundwork for the Roman military system that would eventually conquer the known world. The seventh and final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, known as Tarquin the Proud, would prove to be Rome's last monarch. His tyrannical rule and the scandalous behavior of his family ultimately led to a revolution that would establish the Roman Republic and change the course of history. The overthrow of Tarquin the Proud in 509 BCE marked one of history's most significant political transformations. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we witness the birth of the Roman Republic, a system of government that would endure for nearly 5 centuries and serve as a model for democracies throughout the ages. The catalyst for this revolution came through a tragic event involving Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, and a noble Roman woman named Lucretia. After Sextus assaulted Lucretia, she took her own life rather than live with the dishonor, but not before extracting promises from her male relatives to avenge her death and end the tyrannical rule of the Tarquin family. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, a group of Roman nobles rose up, expelled the royal family, and established a new form of government. The word republic comes from the Latin res publica, meaning the public thing or the people's affair. Instead of being ruled by a single king, Rome would now be governed by 2 elected magistrates called consuls, who would serve for 1 year and check each other's power. This system of shared authority and limited terms would prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power and becoming a tyrant. Breathe slowly and feel yourself relaxing as we explore how this new republic organized itself. The Roman Constitution, though never written down as a single document, evolved into a complex system of checks and balances. At its heart was the principle of collegiality. Important offices were always shared between 2 or more people to prevent the concentration of power. The consulship was the highest office in the land. Each year, 2 consuls were elected to serve as the chief executives, commanding the armies, presiding over the Senate, and executing the laws. They possessed imperium, the supreme authority to command, but this power was limited by their colleagues' right of veto and their single year of service. Below the consuls were the praetors, who administered justice and could command armies when needed. The censors, elected every 5 years, conducted the census, managed public morals, and oversaw the membership of the Senate. Quaestors handled financial matters, while aediles managed public works, festivals, and the grain supply. They kept Rome's growing population fed. The Senate, originally the king's advisory council, became the most influential body in the Roman Republic. Though it technically held no legislative power, its auctoritas, its moral authority and accumulated wisdom, made it the guiding force behind Roman policy. Senators served for life and were drawn from the ranks of former magistrates, creating a body of experienced leaders who provided continuity and institutional memory. Let your mind drift peacefully as we consider the Roman people themselves. For they too played a crucial role in this new system. All citizens were divided into voting assemblies. The centuriate assembly, based on military units and weighted toward the wealthy, elected the highest magistrates and voted on war and peace. The tribal assembly, organized by geographic districts, passed most laws and elected the lower magistrates. The plebeian assembly, which excluded the patrician class entirely, became increasingly important as the common people fought for their rights and recognition. The early years of the Republic were marked by almost constant warfare as Rome struggled to defend itself and establish dominance over its neighbors. The Latin cities, former allies under the monarchy, rebelled against Roman authority. The Etruscan Lars Porsena besieged Rome itself, leading to legendary tales of Roman heroism like Horatius defending the bridge and Mucius, Scaevola burning his own hand to demonstrate Roman resolve. But even as Rome fought external enemies, internal tensions threatened to tear the new republic apart. The struggle between the patricians and plebeians, known as the conflict of the orders, dominated the first 2 centuries of republican history. The patricians, as descendants of the original senators and nobles, claimed exclusive rights to hold major magistracies and interpret religious law. The plebeians, though they comprised the majority of citizens and provided the backbone of the army, found themselves excluded from political power and often oppressed by debt and harsh legal treatment. The plebeians' weapon in this struggle was the threat of withdrawal, the secession. When conditions became unbearable, they would literally leave the city, abandoning their military and economic duties until their grievances were addressed. The first such secession, traditionally dated to 494 BCE, led to the creation of the tribunes of the plebs, officials elected exclusively by and from the plebeian class to protect their interests. The tribunes possessed a remarkable power. They right of veto against any magistrate's action that harmed plebeian interests. Their persons were declared sacrosanct, meaning that anyone who harmed them would be cursed by the gods and could be killed with impunity. They could also convene the plebeian assembly and propose legislation that, once passed, bound all citizens as you settle deeper into rest. Imagine the gradual transformation of Roman society as these conflicts played out over generations. In 451 to 450 BCE, pressure from the plebeians led to the creation of the 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code. Though the laws themselves often favored the wealthy, their publication meant that legal procedures could no longer be kept secret by the patrician priests and magistrates. Gradually, through a series of compromises and concessions, the rigid barriers between patricians and plebeians began to erode. Let the steady rhythm of historical progress lull you as we follow this transformation over generations. In 445 BCE, the Lex Canulea permitted intermarriage between the classes, allowing ambitious plebeian families to ally themselves with patrician houses through matrimony. More significant political victories followed. In 367 BCE, after a decade-long struggle led by the tribunes Licinius and Sextius, the Licinian section laws required that one of the 2 consuls must be a plebeian. This breakthrough opened the highest office in the land to the common people and marked the beginning of the end of patrician monopoly on power. Within a few generations, plebeians would hold all major magistracies, though in practice, political power remained concentrated among the wealthy, regardless of their ancestral class. As these internal struggles played out, Rome was simultaneously expanding its influence throughout central Italy. Feel yourself sinking deeper into tranquility as we witness Rome's gradual conquest of its neighbors through a combination of military prowess, diplomatic skill, and innovative approaches to alliance and integration. The Romans developed a unique system for dealing with conquered peoples. Rather than simply extracting tribute or enslaving defeated populations, as many ancient empires did, Rome offered various forms of partnership and eventual citizenship. Some defeated cities became full Roman municipalities with complete citizen rights. Others received Latin rights, a kind of second-class citizenship that could eventually lead to full Roman status. Still others became allies, maintaining their own governments while providing troops to Rome's armies and following Roman leadership in foreign affairs. This flexible approach to integration helped explain Rome's remarkable success in expansion. Defeated enemies often became loyal allies, and their soldiers would fight alongside Roman legions in future campaigns. The Roman army thus grew stronger with each victory, as it incorporated the manpower and military traditions of its former adversaries. The military itself underwent constant evolution during these early centuries of the Republic. The original Roman army had been based on the Greek phalanx system, with heavily armored soldiers fighting in tight formations with long spears. But Italian warfare, with its hilly terrain and numerous sieges, demanded greater flexibility. Gradually, the Romans developed the manipular system, organizing their forces into smaller, more maneuverable units called maniples that could adapt to different terrains and tactical situations. The Roman legion of this period consisted of about 4,500 men, divided into 120 maniples of roughly 60 to 120 soldiers each. These units were arranged in 3 lines, the hastati in front, composed of younger soldiers, the principes in the middle, made up of men in their prime, and the triarii in the rear, consisting of veterans who served as a reserve. Each soldier was expected to provide his own equipment, with wealthier citizens serving as cavalry or heavily armed infantry, while poorer citizens served as light troops. Let your mind wander peacefully through the Italian countryside as we follow Rome's expanding influence. The conquest of the Italian peninsula took over 2 centuries and involved dozens of campaigns against various enemies. The Volsci and Aqui in the nearby hills provided constant challenges in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. The mighty Etruscan city of Veii, just 12 miles from Rome, required a 10-year siege before falling in 396 BCE, giving Rome control of the Tiber Valley and doubling its territory. But Rome's greatest early test came from an unexpected direction. In 390 BCE, a horde of Celtic warriors, whom the Romans called Gauls, swept down from the north, defeated a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia, and actually captured and sacked the city of Rome itself. Legend tells us that only the garrison on the Capitoline Hill held out, saved by the sacred geese of Juno, whose honking alerted the guards to a nighttime attack. This traumatic experience, known as the Gallic sack, left deep scars on the Romang psyche. For centuries afterward, Romans would fear the return of the Gauls, and this fear would drive much of their later expansion into Gaul and Germany. But in the immediate aftermath, the sack also spurred Rome to rebuild stronger than before. New walls were constructed around the city. Portions of these Servian walls still stand today, and military reforms were implemented to prevent such a disaster from recurring. The recovery from the Gallic sack demonstrated Rome's remarkable resilience, a quality that would serve it well throughout its long history. Rather than being crushed by defeat, Romans typically learned from their mistakes and emerged stronger. This adaptability, combined with their innovative approaches to law, engineering, and governance, helped explain their ultimate success. As you rest comfortably, let yourself be carried forward through the decades of Roman expansion that followed. The 4th century BCE saw Rome gradually extend its control southward into Campania, bringing it into contact with the Greek cities that had been established along Italy's southern coast for centuries. These Greek colonies, known collectively as Magna Graecia or Greater Greece, represented some of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world. Places like Tarentum, Syracuse, and Neapolis possessed advanced architecture, flourishing arts, and philosophical schools that rivaled Athens itself. But their very prosperity made them attractive targets for the aggressive Samnite tribes of the central Apennine Mountains. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we witness Rome's fateful decision to intervene in southern Italian affairs. When the Greek city of Capua appealed for Roman protection against Samnite attacks in 343 BCE, Rome faced a crucial choice. Accepting would mean war with the Samnites, the most formidable military power in central Italy. Refusing would leave Rome's new Campanian allies defenseless and potentially create a powerful Samnite-Greek alliance that could threaten Rome itself. The Romans chose war, beginning the first of 3 great Samnite conflicts that would span over 50 years, and test Romang resolve to its limits. Let yourself drift peacefully as we explore these transformative wars that shaped Rome's military character and territorial ambitions. The Samnites were mountain warriors, tough and hardy fighters, who knew every path and valley in their rugged homeland. Unlike the Romans, who fought in organized formations on open ground, the Samnites excelled at guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and fighting in difficult terrain. Their society was organized around warrior bands, bound by sacred oaths, and they possessed a fierce independence that made them formidable opponents. The First Samnite War, 343341 BCE, ended in Romang victory, but it was quickly followed by the Latin War 340338 BCE, when Rome's oldest allies rebelled, fearing that Roman power was growing too great. The irony was that the Latins, who shared Rome's language and many customs, now viewed their former protectors as potential oppressors. This conflict forced Rome to confront a fundamental question about its expansion. How could it grow without alienating the very allies whose support made that growth possible? The Roman solution was characteristically pragmatic. Instead of simply crushing the rebellious Latins, Rome dissolved the Latin League that had bound these cities together, then offered each city individual treaties with different rights and obligations. Some received full Roman citizenship, others Latin rights, and still others became allied states. This policy of divide and reward prevented future coordinated rebellions while binding former enemies more closely to Roman interests. Feel the weight of history settling gently around you as we follow the Second Samnite War 326-304 BCE. Brutal conflict that saw both triumph and disaster for Roman arms. The war's most famous episode occurred in 321 BCE at a narrow mountain pass called the Caudine Forks. Here, an entire Roman army found itself trapped by Samnite forces with no means of escape or retreat. Rather than slaughter the Romans, the Samnite commander Gaius Pontius faced a dilemma. If he killed them all, he would only enrage Rome further. If he let them go free, they would simply rearm and continue the war. Instead, he chose a middle course that he hoped would end the conflict. He would spare their lives, but force them to undergo the humiliation of passing under the yoke. The entire Roman army, consuls, officers, and common soldiers alike, was forced to strip naked and crawl under a makeshift yoke constructed from 3 spears. This ritual humiliation was designed to break Roman morale and demonstrate Samnite superiority. The survivors were then released and sent home to Rome. But Pontius had gravely underestimated Roman character. Rather than being crushed by this humiliation, the Romans were enraged by it. The Senate refused to honor the treaty there. Generals had been forced to sign, and the war resumed with even greater intensity. The disaster at the Caudine Forks became a rallying cry for revenge, and Roman determination to defeat the Samnites only grew stronger. This episode illustrated a crucial aspect of the Roman mindset that would serve them throughout their history: their ability to transform defeat into motivation for ultimate victory. Time and again, Romans would suffer terrible setbacks, only to return more determined than ever. This psychological resilience, combined with their material resources and organizational skills, made them nearly impossible to defeat permanently. Your mind wandered through the mountain valleys of central Italy as the war continued for 2 more decades. The Romans gradually learned to fight in the Samnites' preferred terrain, developing new tactics and equipment better suited to mountain warfare. They built roads and fortresses to control key strategic points, and they formed alliances with other Italian peoples who had their own reasons to oppose Samnite expansion. The Third Samnite War 298-290 BCE saw the largest coalition yet assembled against Roman power. The Samnites allied not only with various Italian tribes, but also with Celtic Gauls from the north, and even some Etruscan cities. For a moment, it seemed as if all of Rome's enemies had united in a final effort to destroy the rising republic. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BCE. Feel yourself sinking deeper into peaceful rest as we witness this pivotal clash that would determine the fate of Italy. On one side stood the Roman legions and their Italian allies. On the other, a massive confederation of Samnites, Gauls, Etruscans, and Umbrians, perhaps the largest army ever assembled against Roman power. The battle itself was a desperate affair, with victory hanging in the balance for hours. At the crucial moment, when the Roman left wing was crumbling under Gallic assault, the consul Publius Decius Mus performed an extraordinary act of sacrifice. Following an ancient Roman ritual called devotio, he dedicated both his own life and the enemy army to the gods of the underworld, then charged alone into the thickest fighting, seeking death in battle. His sacrifice was believed to invoke divine favor, and indeed, the Romans rallied and won a crushing victory. The aftermath of Sentinum broke the anti-Roman coalition forever. The Gauls retreated beyond the Alps, the Etruscans made peace, and the Samnites found themselves isolated and gradually worn down by continued Roman pressure. By 290 BCE, the last Samnite strongholds had surrendered, and Rome's dominance over central and southern Italy was complete. But even as Rome celebrated these victories, a new and far more dangerous enemy was preparing to test Roman resolve. Let your consciousness drift southward across the Mediterranean to the coast of North Africa, where the city of Carthage had grown into Rome's greatest rival for control of the western Mediterranean. Carthage had been founded in the 9th century BCE by Phoenician colonists from the eastern Mediterranean city of Tyre. Over the centuries, it had developed into a commercial empire whose ships carried goods from Spain to Syria, whose colonies dotted the coasts of North Africa and Spain, and whose wealth rivaled that of the great eastern kingdoms. Unlike Rome, which was primarily a land power sustained by agriculture and conquest, Carthage was a maritime empire built on trade and naval supremacy. The two powers had initially maintained peaceful relations, even signing treaties that divided their spheres of influence in the Mediterranean. But as Roman power expanded and Carthaginian trade routes grew more extensive, conflict became inevitable. The spark that ignited war came from an unlikely source, the island of Sicily. Allow yourself to relax completely as we explore how a local conflict in Sicily escalated into a world war that would last over a century and determine whether Rome or Carthage would dominate the ancient world. The immediate cause was a dispute over the city of Messana, which controlled the narrow strait between Sicily and Italy. When a group of Italian mercenaries seized the city and then called for help against Carthaginian intervention, both Rome and Carthage found themselves drawn into what would become the First Punic War. The Romans called their Carthaginian enemies Puni or Punics, from the Latin word for Phoenician, giving these conflicts their historical name. The First Punic War 264-241 BCE would prove to be the longest continuous war in ancient history up to that time, testing both powers to their limits and transforming the nature of warfare in the Mediterranean. For Rome, the war presented unprecedented challenges. The Romans were essentially a land power. Their military strength lay in their disciplined legions and their ability to integrate conquered peoples into their alliance system. But Sicily was an island, and controlling it required naval power that Rome simply did not possess. The Romans had never built a serious navy, relying instead on their Greek and Latin allies for what little maritime transport they needed. Carthage, by contrast, was the premier naval power of its time. Carthaginian warships had controlled Mediterranean trade routes for centuries, and their admirals possessed generations of experience in naval warfare. Their ships were faster and more maneuverable than anything the Romans could field, and their crews were seasoned professionals who had learned their craft over lifetimes at sea. But the Romans, with characteristic determination, refused to let their naval inexperience prevent them from fighting for Sicily. According to legend, they captured a stranded Carthaginian warship, used it as a model to build their own fleet, and trained their crews by having them practice rowing on wooden benches set up on dry land. While this story may be exaggerated, it captures something essential about Roman character: their willingness to learn new skills and adapt to new challenges, rather than accept limitations. Feel yourself drifting peacefully as we follow Rome's gradual mastery of naval warfare. The Romans compensated for their inexperience at sea by trying to turn naval battles into land battles. They invented a boarding device called the corvus, a hinged bridge with a spike that could be dropped onto enemy ships, allowing Roman marines to charge across and fight hand-to-hand combat on enemy decks. This innovative Roman approach proved remarkably effective in early naval encounters. Let your mind drift peacefully across the Mediterranean waves as we witness the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, where the Roman admiral Gaius Duilius won Rome's first great naval victory using these new tactics. The corvus allowed Roman soldiers to do what they did best: fight hand-to-hand combat. Even on the rolling decks of warships at sea. The victory at Mylae shocked the Carthaginian world and demonstrated that Roman adaptability could overcome even centuries of Carthaginian naval experience. Duilius was honored with the first naval triumph in Roman history, and a column decorated with the bronze rams of captured Carthaginian ships was erected in the Forum to commemorate this historic achievement. But naval warfare proved far more expensive and unpredictable than land campaigns. Feel yourself sinking deeper into rest as we follow the enormous costs of maintaining fleets in the Mediterranean. Ships required not only massive initial investments in construction, but also constant maintenance, experienced crews, and protection from the storms that could destroy entire fleets in a matter of hours. The Romans learned these harsh lessons through bitter experience. In 255 BC, a Roman fleet returning from a failed invasion of North Africa was caught in a storm off Sicily and lost over 250 ships with their entire crews. Perhaps 100,000 men drowned in a single day. This disaster was followed by another massive shipwreck in 249 BCE, leading some Romans to question whether the gods themselves opposed their naval ambitions. Yet the Romans persisted with their characteristic stubbornness. They rebuilt their fleets again and again, financing new construction through loans from wealthy citizens and allies. The war became a contest of endurance. Which power could sustain the enormous costs of naval warfare longer? For over 2 decades, the answer remained unclear, as both sides won victories and suffered defeats without achieving decisive advantage. The turning point came through Roman determination to end the war decisively. In 241 BCE, despite having recently lost another fleet to storms, the Romans made one final effort to build a new navy. This time, however, the state treasury was exhausted, so wealthy citizens voluntarily funded the construction, with the understanding that they would be repaid only if the war was won. This new fleet, commanded by the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, caught the Carthaginian navy by surprise near the Aegates Islands off Sicily's western coast. The Carthaginians, expecting no Roman naval opposition, had loaded their ships with supplies for their besieged garrisons rather than preparing for battle. In the ensuing engagement, the Romans destroyed or captured most of the Carthaginian fleet, finally achieving the decisive naval victory that had eluded them for over 20 years. With their fleet destroyed and their Sicilian strongholds cut off from resupply, the Carthaginians were forced to seek peace. The treaty that ended the First Punic War required Carthage to evacuate Sicily entirely, pay a massive indemnity to Rome, and promise not to attack Roman allies. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, marking the beginning of Roman imperial expansion beyond Italy. But peace between Rome and Carthage proved to be merely an intermission between rounds of a longer struggle. Let your consciousness drift forward through the years of uneasy peace as both powers licked their wounds and prepared for the next phase of their conflict. The interwar period saw significant developments in both empires. Rome organized Sicily as its first province, appointing Roman governors and extracting tribute from the fertile island. The Romans also took advantage of Carthaginian weakness to seize Sardinia and Corsica, claiming that Carthaginian preparations to retake these islands violated their peace treaty. Meanwhile, Carthage sought to compensate for its losses by expanding its empire in Spain. The Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, father of the future Hannibal, led this expansion with energy and skill. Spanish silver mines helped replenish Carthaginian finances, while Spanish warriors provided new recruits for Carthaginian armies. Most importantly, the conquest of Spain gave Carthage a potential land route to attack Italy, avoiding the Roman-controlled seas. Allow yourself to relax completely as we approach one of history's most dramatic conflicts. The Second Punic War 2182-01 BCE would see the emergence of perhaps the greatest military genius of the ancient world and would bring Rome closer to destruction than ever before or after. The war began over the Spanish city of Saguntum, a Ramon ally that found itself under siege by Carthaginian forces led by Hannibal Barca, Hamilcar's son. When Rome demanded that Carthage withdraw, the Carthaginian government faced a fateful choice. They could abandon their Spanish conquests and submit to Roman demands, or they could support Hannibal and risk another war with Rome. The Carthaginians chose war, perhaps believing that Hannibal's genius could succeed where conventional strategies had failed. They could hardly have imagined the incredible campaign that Hannibal was already planning: an overland march from Spain, across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the Alps themselves to bring war directly to Italian soil. Feel yourself sinking into deeper tranquility as we witness one of history's most audacious military campaigns. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca assembled an army of nearly 100,000 men and 37 war elephants at New Carthage in Spain. His force included Spanish infantry, Numidian cavalry from North Africa, and a corps of veteran Carthaginian officers who had served under his father Hamilcar. The Romans expected Hannibal to attempt another naval invasion of Sicily, or perhaps attack Roman territories in Spain. They could never have imagined that the young Carthaginian general, he was only 29 years old, was planning to march his entire army overland to Italy, crossing mountain ranges that were considered nearly impassable, even for small groups of travelers. Let your mind wander peacefully through the Iberian Peninsula as we follow Hannibal's initial advance. His army moved swiftly through eastern Spain, subduing hostile tribes and adding their warriors to his ranks. By the time he reached the Pyrenees Mountains, which separate Spain from Gaul, his forces had grown even larger, though he left substantial garrisons behind to secure his supply lines. The crossing of the Pyrenees presented the first serious challenge of the campaign. These mountains, though lower than the Alps, were inhabited by fierce Celtic tribes who had no love for Carthaginians or any other foreign invaders. Hannibal's army fought its way through narrow mountain passes, losing men to both enemy attacks and the treacherous terrain. Some Spanish troops, seeing the dangers ahead and realizing how far from home they were being taken, deserted and returned to their villages. But Hannibal pressed onward, and by late summer his army had entered Gaul, the land we now know as France. Here he faced a different set of challenges. The Gallic tribes were divided in their attitudes toward this foreign army. Some saw Hannibal as a potential ally against their common enemy, Rome. Others feared that any foreign army passing through their territory would bring destruction and chaos. Still others hoped to profit by selling supplies to the Carthaginians, or by serving as mercenaries in their ranks. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we follow Hannibal's diplomatic and military maneuvering through Gaul. The young general proved himself to be not only a gifted tactician, but also a skilled diplomat. He negotiated passage through some tribal territories, fought brief campaigns against hostile tribes, and carefully managed his army's interactions with local populations to minimize conflicts that might delay his advance dot as autumn approached. Hannibal's army reached the banks of the Rhine River, the last major obstacle before the Alps themselves. Here they encountered a massive Gallic army determined to prevent their crossing. The Gauls lined the eastern bank of the river, ready to attack any Carthaginian forces that attempted to cross the wide, swift-flowing stream. Hannibal's solution demonstrated the tactical brilliance that would make him legendary. Instead of attempting a direct assault across the river, he sent a detachment of troops upstream under cover of darkness to cross at an undefended point. When his main army began crossing at the contested ford the next morning, this flanking force attacked the Gauls from behind, throwing them into confusion and allowing the main Carthaginian army to complete its crossing with minimal casualties. Crossing of the Rhine also presented unique logistical challenges, particularly regarding Hannibal's war elephants. These massive animals, trained for battle but not for swimming, had to be coaxed onto specially constructed rafts and ferried across the river. Ancient sources describe the panic and chaos as some elephants fell into the water, trumpeting in terror while their mahouts tried desperately to guide them to safety. Remarkably, most of the elephants survived the crossing, though several were lost to drowning or injury. Rest peacefully as we approach the most famous and treacherous portion of Hannibal's journey, the crossing of the Alps. By October 218 BCE, with winter approaching and snow already beginning to fall in the high mountains, Hannibal's army began its ascent into the Alpine passes. The exact route he took remains a subject of scholarly debate, but ancient sources agree on the extraordinary hardships his men endured during this crossing. The Alps in autumn are a landscape of breathtaking beauty and deadly peril. Let your mind drift through these ancient mountains as we follow Hannibal's army up winding paths barely wide enough for single files of men, across narrow ledges with 1,000-foot drops below, and through passes where howling winds and driving snow made visibility almost impossible. The local Celtic tribes, the Allobroges, initially appeared friendly and offered to guide the Carthaginian army through the mountains. But this proved to be a trap. Once Hannibal's forces were strung out along narrow mountain paths with no room to maneuver, the tribesmen attacked from above, rolling boulders down on the helpless soldiers and picking off stragglers with arrows and spears. Hannibal's response showed both his tactical skill and his personal courage. He personally led a night attack on the tribal stronghold that controlled the pass, capturing it and securing supplies that his army desperately needed. But this victory came at a terrible cost in men and materials, and worse challenges lay ahead. The higher the Carthaginian army climbed, the more treacherous the conditions became. Let yourself sink deeper into peaceful rest as we witness the epic struggle against nature itself that would become legendary throughout the ancient world. The narrow paths, carved by centuries of wind and water, crumbled under the weight of thousands of men, horses, and elephants. Men fell to their deaths when loose rocks gave way beneath their feet, while pack animals tumbled into chasms so deep that their cries echoed for long moments before being swallowed by silence. The cold became a relentless enemy. Soldiers who had marched through the warm valleys of Spain now found their fingers too numb to grip their weapons, their feet frozen inside their sandals. Many men suffered from what we now know as altitude sickness, The thin mountain air left them gasping for breath and dizzy with exhaustion. Some simply collapsed and could not be roused, their bodies shutting down in the face of conditions no human was meant to endure. The elephants, those mighty symbols of Carthaginian power, suffered terribly in the alpine cold. These creatures, from the warm climates of Africa, had never experienced snow and ice. Their feet, designed for sandy deserts and grassy plains, were lacerated by sharp rocks and frozen by the bitter cold. Several died during the crossing, their massive bodies blocking narrow paths and forcing the army to spend precious hours clearing the way forward. Food became desperately scarce as the army climbed higher into regions where nothing grew except scattered patches of grass and stunted shrubs. The pack animals that carried the army's supplies began to die from exhaustion and cold, their loads having to be abandoned or redistributed among the surviving men. Hannibal's soldiers found themselves eating leather, tree bark, and anything else that might provide even minimal nourishment. Feel the mountain winds carrying you deeper into rest as we witness perhaps the most dangerous moment of the entire crossing. After days of climbing through increasingly hostile terrain, Hannibal's army encountered a massive rockfall that had completely blocked their intended path. The ancient route that local guides had promised would lead them to Italy was impassable. Tons of stone and debris created a barrier that seemed impossible to overcome. Hannibal's engineers worked frantically to clear a new path, but the rocky, alpine terrain resisted their efforts. Traditional tools were inadequate for the task, and time was running out as winter storms grew more frequent and severe. It was then that Hannibal ordered one of the most ingenious engineering solutions. In military history, his men built enormous fires against the rock face, heating the stone until it was burning hot. Then they poured vinegar, the strongest acid available to them, over the heated rocks. The rapid temperature change caused the stone to crack and split, allowing the soldiers to break through sections that would have been impossible to clear otherwise. Working in shifts around the clock, the army gradually carved a new path through the obstacle. This famous episode, recorded by the historian Livy, demonstrates not only Hannibal's resourcefulness, but also the incredible determination of his army. These men had already endured weeks of hardship in some of the most challenging terrain on earth, yet they continued to follow their young commander because they believed in his vision and trusted his leadership. After 15 days in the Alps, days that seemed like months to the exhausted soldiers, Hannibal's army finally began its descent toward the Italian plains. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we witness their emergence from the mountains like ghosts from another world, forever changed by their ordeal. The army that descended into Italy bore little resemblance to the confident force that had left Spain months earlier. Of the nearly 100,000 men who had begun the march, fewer than 26,000 remained. Most of the war elephants had died in the mountain crossing, and those that survived were weakened and sick. The men themselves were gaunt from hunger, their equipment damaged, their spirits tested to the breaking point. Yet, in another sense, this reduced army was more formidable than the larger force that had left Spain. The survivors were hardened, veterans who had overcome challenges that seemed impossible. They had absolute confidence in their commander and unshakable bonds of loyalty forged through shared suffering. Most importantly, they had achieved what everyone said could not be done. They had brought a Carthaginian army to Italy itself, threatening Rome's heartland for the first time in over a century. The Romans were thunderstruck by news of Hannibal's arrival. Their entire strategy had been based on fighting Carthage in Spain and Africa while keeping the war far from Italian soil. Now suddenly there was an enemy army in northern Italy, and worse yet, it was commanded by a general whose tactical brilliance would soon become legendary. Allow yourself to drift peacefully as we witness Rome's initial response to this unprecedented threat. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had been preparing to invade Spain, rushed north with his legions to confront Hannibal near the Ticinus River. This first encounter between Roman and Carthaginian forces in Italy was relatively small, more of a cavalry skirmish than a major battle, but its results were ominous for Rome. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry, the finest light horsemen in the ancient world, proved devastatingly effective against the Roman cavalry in this first engagement. Let your mind drift peacefully as we witness how these skilled African horsemen, riding without saddles or bridles, and controlling their mounts with nothing more than voice commands and shifting weight, completely outmaneuvered the heavier Roman cavalry. The consul Scipio himself was wounded in this skirmish, and would have been killed had his 18-year-old son not charged into the melee to rescue him. This young man, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, would later become known as Scipio Africanus, and would prove to be the only Roman general capable of matching Hannibal's tactical genius. But that triumph lay many years in the future, for now Rome faced an immediate crisis that seemed almost impossible to resolve. The psychological impact of Hannibal's presence in Italy went far beyond military considerations. Feel yourself sinking deeper into tranquil rest as we explore how the news of his arrival spread terror throughout the Italian peninsula. For generations, Romans had grown accustomed to fighting their wars on foreign soil, secure in the knowledge that their homeland was protected by the sea and by their network of loyal allies. Now suddenly, an enemy army was marching through the Po Valley, and Rome's northern allies were beginning to waver in their loyalty. Many of the Gallic tribes in northern Italy, who had been conquered by Rome within living memory, saw Hannibal's arrival as an opportunity to regain their independence. Warriors who had been forced to fight in Roman armies now deserted to join the Carthaginian cause, bringing with them detailed knowledge of Roman military practices and local geography. Hannibal's army, which had been so reduced by the Alpine crossing, began to grow again as these tribal reinforcements swelled his ranks. The Romans responded to this crisis with characteristic determination. The Senate recalled legions from Sicily and Sardinia, raised new armies throughout central Italy, and prepared for what everyone recognized would be a struggle for Rome's very survival. But Roman military doctrine, developed through centuries of successful warfare, was poorly suited to face an opponent like Hannibal. Roman generals were trained to seek decisive battles where their disciplined legions could overwhelm enemy forces through superior organization and determination. They expected to win wars through a series of hard-fought but straightforward engagements in which Roman military virtues would ultimately prevail. Hannibal, however, had no intention of fighting the kind of war that Romans understood. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we witness the emergence of Hannibal's revolutionary approach to warfare. Instead of seeking the kind of frontal battles that Romans preferred, he would use deception, misdirection, and tactical surprise to negate Roman advantages in numbers and equipment. His goal was not merely to win battles, but to destroy Roman armies so completely that Rome's alliance system would collapse, and the Italian peoples would abandon their Roman overlords. The first major demonstration of Hannibal's tactical genius came at the Battle of Trebia in December 18 BCE. The Roman consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, eager for glory and confident in Roman military superiority, allowed himself to be drawn into exactly the kind of battle that Hannibal wanted to fight. Hannibal positioned his main army on the far side of the Trebia River, seeming to offer the Romans the direct confrontation they desired. But he had secretly positioned his brother Mago with 2,000 elite troops in concealed positions along the riverbank. When the Romans advanced across the icy river to attack what they thought was the main Carthaginian army, they found themselves caught in a carefully prepared trap. The Roman soldiers, already exhausted from wading through the freezing water, discovered that Hannibal had arranged his forces in a carefully planned formation. His weakest troops, Spanish and Gallic warriors, held the center, while his strongest forces, African infantry and Numidian cavalry, were positioned on the flanks. As the Romans drove forward against the apparently yielding center, Hannibal's flanking forces closed in from both sides. But the masterstroke came when Mago's hidden forces emerged from their concealment and attacked the Romans from behind. Caught between multiple enemy forces, unable to maneuver effectively, and already weakened by the river crossing, the Roman army was virtually annihilated. Of the 40,000 Roman allied troops who entered the battle, fewer than 10,000 escaped to fight another day. Rest peacefully as we witness the psychological impact of this disaster on Roman morale. The loss at Trebia was not merely a military defeat. It was a demonstration that Roman tactical methods, successful for centuries, were inadequate against Hannibal's innovative approach to warfare. For the first time since the Gallic sack 4 centuries earlier, Romans began to question whether their military system could protect them from a truly dangerous enemy. News of the disaster at Trebia sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. Let your consciousness drift peacefully as we witness how Rome's allies throughout Italy began to reconsider their loyalties. Cities that had been firmly Roman for generations suddenly found themselves questioning whether their allegiance to Rome was wise if Rome itself could not protect them from this Carthaginian genius. The winter of 218-217 BCE was the darkest Rome had experienced in living memory. Hannibal established winter quarters in the fertile Po Valley, allowing his army to rest and refit while he planned his next campaign. His troops, now reinforced by thousands of Gallic warriors eager to strike back at their Roman conquerors, had grown confident in their invincibility. More importantly, Hannibal spent these months studying Roman psychology and military doctrine, preparing even more devastating surprises for the campaigns to come. Rome's response revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of republican government. In crisis, the Senate engaged in furious debates about strategy, with some senators advocating defensive measures while others demanded immediate offensive action to drive the invader from Italian soil. The democratic process that served Rome well in normal times now seemed inadequate to face an enemy who moved with the speed and decisiveness of an absolute monarch. Feel yourself sinking deeper into restful sleep as we witness the emergence of one of Rome's most controversial figures during this crisis. Quintus Fabius Maximus, appointed dictator in 217 BCE with emergency powers to deal with the Carthaginian threat, proposed a radically different approach to warfare than anything Rome had previously attempted. Fabius understood that Hannibal's greatest weapon was his tactical brilliance in set-piece battles. Therefore, Fabius argued, Rome must refuse to give Hannibal the kind of direct confrontations he wanted. Instead, Roman forces should shadow the Carthaginian army, harassing its foraging parties, cutting off its supplies, and gradually wearing it down without ever risking a major engagement. This strategy, which became known as Fabian tactics after its originator, was deeply unpopular with most Romans. It seemed cowardly and unworthy of Roman military traditions. Roman soldiers had been trained to believe that courage and determination could overcome any enemy, and Fabius was asking them to avoid battle entirely. His critics nicknamed him Cunctator, the Delayer, a title that was meant as mockery, but would eventually become a badge of honor. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we follow Hannibal's renewed advance in the spring of 217 BCE. The Carthaginian general had chosen his next target carefully, the road to Rome itself, which ran through the marshes and hills of central Italy. By threatening Rome directly, he hoped to force the Romans into another pitched battle where his superior tactics could destroy another consular army. Hannibal's route took him through the infamous marshes of the Arno River, a landscape of stagnant water, quicksand, and disease-carrying insects. This journey proved almost as challenging as the Alpine crossing, though in completely different ways. Let your mind drift peacefully through these ancient wetlands as we witness another demonstration of Hannibal's extraordinary leadership. 4. 4 days and 3 nights, the Carthaginian army slogged through waist-deep swamp water, never able to rest on dry ground, constantly tormented by clouds of mosquitoes and flies. Many soldiers developed fevers and infections, while others simply collapsed from exhaustion and drowned in the murky water. Hannibal himself contracted an eye infection that eventually cost him the sight in one eye, a permanent reminder of the sacrifices he made for his cause. But the army emerged from the marshes intact and continued its advance toward Rome. As Fabius had predicted, Hannibal was actively seeking another major battle, and Roman popular opinion was demanding that their new consul, Gaius Flaminius, give him exactly what he wanted. The pressure on Flaminius was enormous. His predecessor's cautious strategy was seen as cowardly, and the Roman people expected their leaders to show courage and aggression in the face of enemy challenges. Rest peacefully as we approach one of the most perfect ambushes in military history. Hannibal had chosen his next battlefield with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized all his previous campaigns. Near Lake Trasimene in central Italy, the road passed through a narrow valley between the lake and surrounding hills. Morning mists rising from the lake would provide perfect concealment for hidden forces, while the narrow confines of the valley would prevent the Romans from deploying their legions in their preferred formations. On the morning of June 24, 217 BCE, Consul Gaius Flaminius led his army of 25,000 men into what would become one of history's most perfectly executed ambushes. Let your mind drift peacefully as we witness this masterpiece of military deception that would forever change the balance of power between Rome and Carthage. The Roman column stretched for miles along the narrow lakeside road, with no scouts ahead, and no awareness of the danger that awaited them. Flaminius, eager to catch up with what he believed was a retreating enemy, had abandoned the caution that centuries of military experience should have taught him. In his haste to engage Hannibal before the Carthaginian could escape, he was leading his army into a trap so perfectly designed that escape would be virtually impossible. As dawn broke over Lake Trasimene, thick mists rose from the water's surface, creating an ethereal landscape where visibility extended only a few dozen yards in any direction. Feel yourself sinking deeper into tranquil rest as we witness how Hannibal had spent the previous evening positioning his forces with mathematical precision along the hills overlooking the road. The Carthaginian general had divided his army into carefully coordinated segments. His African veterans occupied the hills at the far end of the valley, blocking any possible Roman retreat. Spanish and Gallic infantry were hidden along the slopes on the right side of the road, while his devastating Numidian cavalry waded in concealment on the left, ready to sweep down and complete the encirclement. Once the Romans had fully entered the killing zone, the first Romans to die never even saw their attackers. As the morning mist began to thin, war cries erupted from every hillside simultaneously. Thousands of Carthaginian warriors charged down the slopes, their weapons flashing in the pale morning light, while the Romans found themselves trapped in the narrow confines of the valley with no room to maneuver or form proper battle lines. Consul Flaminius tried desperately to rally his men and organize some semblance of resistance, but the carefully planned ambush was unfolding with clockwork precision. Roman soldiers, trained to fight in organized formations with their comrades beside them, found themselves isolated in small groups, cut off from their officers, and surrounded by enemies attacking from all directions. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we witness the tragic heroism of Roman soldiers fighting against impossible odds. Individual acts of courage emerged from the chaos. Centurions rallying their men for desperate last stands, cavalry officers attempting suicidal charges to break through enemy lines, common soldiers fighting back-to-back against overwhelming numbers. But courage alone could not overcome the tactical perfection of Hannibal's ambush. The battle, if it could be called a battle, lasted barely 3 hours. When the mists finally cleared completely, the shores of Lake Trasimene were littered with Romans dead. Consul Flaminius himself lay among them, killed while trying to organize a counterattack that might have saved at least part of his army. Of the 25,000 Romans who had entered the valley that morning, fewer than 10,000 survived, and most of those were prisoners. The psychological impact of Lake Trasimene was even more devastating than its immediate military consequences. Rest peacefully. As we explore how news of this second catastrophic defeat spread terror throughout the Roman world. Within 2 years, Hannibal had destroyed 2 entire consular armies, killing or capturing over 50,000 Romans and allied soldiers. No enemy had inflicted such losses on Rome since the Gallic sack centuries earlier. More alarmingly, Hannibal's victories were not the result of superior numbers or equipment, but of tactical genius that seemed to render traditional Roman military methods obsolete. The Romans began to fear that they were facing not just a skilled general, but a supernatural opponent whose victories defied normal military logic. This fear was compounded when news arrived of another disaster. A Roman cavalry force of 4,000 men sent to reinforce Flaminius had been intercepted and destroyed by Hannibal's Numidian cavalry after the main battle. The Carthaginian war machine seemed unstoppable, capable of defeating any Roman force regardless of its size or quality. Your consciousness drift peacefully as we witness Rome's darkest hour. Panic gripped the city as refugees streamed in from the countryside, bringing tales of Carthaginian atrocities and rumors that Hannibal himself was marching on Rome. The Senate met in emergency session while crowds gathered in the forum, demanding action but uncertain what action could possibly succeed against this seemingly invincible enemy. It was in this moment of supreme crisis that the wisdom of Fabius Maximus's strategy became apparent. The Romans finally understood that conventional warfare against Hannibal was suicide, and that their only hope lay in avoiding the kind of pitched battles where his tactical genius could destroy their armies. Fabius was recalled to active command, and his policy of harassment without engagement became official Roman strategy. The implementation of Fabian's strategy marked a fundamental shift in Roman military thinking. Allow yourself to drift deeper into peaceful rest as we witness how Rome learned to fight a completely different kind of war against this unprecedented enemy. Instead of seeking glorious victories in pitched battles, Roman armies now became shadows, following Hannibal's movements while carefully avoiding direct confrontation. This new approach required tremendous discipline from Roman soldiers who had been raised on stories of heroic charges and glorious victories. Now they were asked to watch enemy forces pillage Italian countryside while they remained hidden in the hills, striking only at isolated foraging parties and supply convoys. It seemed cowardly to men trained in the Roman military tradition, yet it was slowly beginning to work. Feel yourself sinking into deeper tranquility as we follow Hannibal's growing frustration with Roman tactics during the summer of 217 BCE. The Carthaginian general found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His army needed supplies, but every foraging expedition was harassed by Roman forces that melted away whenever he concentrated his troops for battle. His soldiers, accustomed to the spoils of victory, grew restless as they were denied the decisive engagements they craved. More troubling for Hannibal was his strategic situation. He had won 2 crushing victories over Roman armies, yet Rome showed no signs of seeking peace. The Roman alliance system, which he had hoped to shatter through military defeat, remained largely intact. Most Italian cities continued to honor their treaties with Rome, whether from loyalty or fear, and Hannibal's army remained isolated in hostile territory. The Carthaginian general attempted various strategies to force the Romans into battle. He marched his army through the richest agricultural regions of central Italy, burning crops and destroying farmsteads, hoping that the devastation would compel Roman commanders to abandon their defensive strategy. When this failed, he tried psychological warfare, spreading rumors that he was marching directly on Rome itself. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we witness one of the most clever episodes of this shadow war. Hannibal captured a Roman prisoner, who served as a guide to Fabius's camp, and deliberately released him with false information about his intended route. When Fabius positioned his forces to intercept what he believed would be Hannibal's line of march, the Carthaginian army appeared in a completely different location, having taken a path that the Romans had assumed was impassable. But perhaps Hannibal's most ingenious deception involved a herd of oxen. Finding himself trapped in a valley with Roman forces blocking the only exit, Hannibal ordered his soldiers to tie burning torches to the horns of several hundred cattle and drive them up the mountainside during the night. Roman sentries, seeing the moving lights, assumed that Hannibal's entire army was attempting to escape over the mountains and shifted their positions to intercept this phantom force. Meanwhile, the real Carthaginian army slipped away through the now unguarded pass. These episodes demonstrated Hannibal's tactical brilliance, but they also revealed the limitations of his strategic position. Despite his victories, he was gradually being worn down by the constant need to find food and supplies in hostile territory, while avoiding the kind of major battle that might decisive victory, but could also result in catastrophic defeat if his tactical genius failed him even once. Rest peacefully as we witness the growing impatience of the Roman people with Fabius's strategy. The Roman public, watching their countryside being systematically devastated while their armies avoided battle, began to question whether their leaders possessed the courage to defend the Republic. Critics argued that Fabius's tactics were allowing Hannibal to destroy Italy piece by piece, while Roman forces remained passive spectators. This popular discontent reached a crisis point when Fabius's term as dictator expired and normal consular elections resumed. The Roman people, frustrated by months of apparent inaction, elected two consuls who promised to return to aggressive military action. Marcus Terentius Varro, a popular leader who appealed to the common people, and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, an experienced general from an aristocratic family. The election of these consuls in 216 BCE set the stage for what would become the most famous battle of the Second Punic War and arguably one of the most significant battles in all of human history. Feel yourself drifting peacefully as we witness the Roman decision to abandon the caution that had served them well and return to the kind of direct confrontation that had proven so disastrous at Trebia and Lake Trasimene. The Roman people demanded decisive action, and their new consuls were prepared to give it to them. The Senate authorized the raising of the largest army in Roman history, 8 legions plus an equal number of allied troops, totaling nearly 90,000 men. This massive force would seek out Hannibal and destroy him in the kind of pitched battle that Romans understood, restoring Roman military honor and ending the only Carthaginian threat once and for all. Allow your consciousness to drift southward through the Italian peninsula as we follow the movements of both armies toward their fateful meeting near the small town of Cannae in southeastern Italy. Hannibal had established his base near the town of Cannae, positioning his army to control the vital grain supplies that Rome needed to feed its growing population. Let your mind drift peacefully as we witness how the Carthaginian general had once again chosen his battlefield with meticulous care. The plains around Cannae offered exactly the kind of open terrain where a smaller, more maneuverable army could use superior tactics to defeat a larger but less flexible opponent. The site held both strategic and symbolic importance. Cannae controlled one of the major Roman supply depots in southern Italy, and its capture had disrupted grain shipments to Rome itself. By threatening this vital resource, Hannibal was forcing the Romans to fight on ground of his choosing. where his tactical genius could be employed to maximum effect. Feel yourself sinking deeper into restful sleep as we witness the final preparations for what would become the most studied battle in military history. The massive Roman army, commanded alternately by the two consuls, according to ancient tradition, represented not just Rome's military strength, but its national pride and determination. Every citizen understood that this battle would determine whether Rome survived as an independent power or submitted to Carthaginian dominance. Consul Varro, commanding on the day of battle, was determined to use Rome's overwhelming numerical advantage to crush Hannibal through sheer force. The traditional Roman approach called for a frontal assault with densely packed legions that would overwhelm enemy forces through disciplined advance and superior numbers. What could be simpler than marching 90,000 Roman soldiers directly at Hannibal's 50,000 Carthaginians and crushing them through sheer weight of numbers? Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we witness Hannibal's final preparations for his masterpiece of tactical deception. The Carthaginian general had studied Roman military doctrine for years, and he understood exactly how Varro would deploy his massive army. The Romans would place their strongest troops in the center, packed so densely that individual soldiers would have barely room to swing their swords, and advance in an irresistible formation that had conquered most of the known world. But Hannibal had prepared a trap so elegant and devastating that military strategists would study it for over 2,000 years. Instead of trying to match Roman strength with strength, he would use their own power against them, turning their numerical advantage into a fatal weakness through the most perfect double envelopment in military history. On the morning of August 216 BCE, as the summer sun rose over the plains of southeastern Italy, both armies deployed for battle. Rest peacefully as we witness the careful choreography of Hannibal's deployment. He placed his weakest troops, Spanish and Gallic warriors, in the center of his line, forming a convex bulge that projected toward the approaching Romans. These men were brave fighters, but they lacked the training and equipment of professional soldiers, and Hannibal expected them to give ground when the Roman attack began. On the flanks of this weak center, Hannibal positioned his strongest forces, veteran African infantry, equipped with Roman weapons and armor taken from previous victories. These troops were hidden behind the forward-projecting center, invisible to Roman observers, who saw only the apparently weak Gallic and Spanish forces. Directly ahead of them, the masterstroke of Hannibal's deployment was his cavalry arrangement. His superb Numidian light cavalry held the left flank, while his heavy cavalry, commanded by his brother Hasdrubal, occupied the right. These horsemen would prove to be the key to the entire battle, though their importance was not yet apparent. To the confident Roman commanders, feel yourself drifting peacefully as we witness the opening moments of the Battle of Cannae. The Roman advance began exactly as Hannibal had anticipated. The densely packed legions, their bronze armor glinting in the morning sun, marched forward in perfect formation, confident that their superior numbers would overwhelm any resistance the Carthaginians could offer. The initial contact seemed to confirm Roman expectations. The Gallic and Spanish troops in Hannibal's center, facing overwhelming pressure from the advancing legions, began to give ground just as their general had planned. The Romans pressed forward eagerly, sensing victory as their enemies appeared to retreat in disorder. But this apparent retreat was the most crucial element of Hannibal's trap. As the center gradually gave way, the Roman legions pushed deeper into what was becoming a pocket, their formations becoming increasingly compressed as they pursued what they believed were fleeing enemies. The dense Roman ranks, packed so tightly that fallen soldiers had no room to collapse, continued their relentless advance. Allow your consciousness to drift as we witness the moment when Hannibal's trap began to close. As the Roman center advanced deeper into the Carthaginian position, the veteran African troops on both flanks began to wheel inward. attacking the exposed sides of the Romang formation. Simultaneously, Hasdrubal's cavalry, having routed their Roman counterparts, swept around behind the Roman army to attack from the rear. The Roman army, which had begun the day as a confident force advancing to victory, now found itself trapped in a tightening vice from which there could be no escape. Rest peacefully as we witness the culmination of Hannibal's tactical masterpiece. A moment that would echo through military academies and strategic studies for millennia to come. The Romans, pressed on all sides by Carthaginian forces, could no longer maintain their disciplined formations. The tight-packed legions that had been Rome's greatest strength now became a fatal weakness, as soldiers found themselves unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, and increasingly unable to fight effectively as their comrades fell around them and compressed their formations even further. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we witness the terrible arithmetic of encirclement. What had begun as a Romang numerical advantage of nearly 2-1 had been transformed through tactical genius into a Carthaginian advantage at every point of contact. The outer Roman ranks faced multiple enemies attacking from different directions, while the inner ranks could do nothing but await their turn to die, pressed so tightly together that many could not even raise their weapons. Consul Paulus, the more experienced of the two Roman commanders, realized the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him. Fighting desperately to maintain some semblance of order, he moved through the chaos, trying to rally his men. But the tactical situation had moved beyond anything that courage or leadership could remedy. The battle had become a slaughter, methodical and inescapable. Feel yourself sinking deeper into tranquil rest as we witness the final moments of one of history's most complete military defeats. By afternoon, the plains of Cannae were carpeted with Roman dead. Of the nearly 90,000 Romans and allies who had entered the battle that morning, approximately 70,000 lay dead or dying. Among the casualties was Consul Paulus himself, who died fighting beside his men rather than survive such a catastrophic defeat. The survivors, fewer than 15,000 men, scattered across the Italian countryside as fugitives from the greatest military disaster in Roman history. Many would never make it home, falling victim to Carthaginian pursuit, local bandits, or simple exposure and starvation. The cream of Roman military leadership, experienced centurions, staff officers, and veteran soldiers who had formed the backbone of Roman power, lay dead on the field at Cannae. But perhaps even more significant than the immediate military losses was the psychological impact of this unprecedented defeat. Allow your mind to drift peacefully as we explore how news of Cannae sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. Rome, which had seemed invincible in its rise to dominance over Italy, had been revealed as vulnerable to a commander of sufficient genius and determination throughout Italy. Roman allies who had remained loyal through previous defeats now began to reconsider their allegiances. The southern Italian cities of Capua, Tarentum, and others opened their gates to Carthaginian forces, calculating that Hannibal's victory at Cannae proved that Rome's power was broken forever. In distant lands, kings and rulers who had feared Roman expansion now began to see opportunity in Rome's apparent weakness. The news reached Rome itself 3 days after the battle, carried by one of the few surviving Roman officers who had witnessed the disaster firsthand. Rest peacefully as we witness the city's reaction to tidings that seemed to herald the end of their republic and perhaps their very existence as an independent people. The Senate met in emergency session while crowds gathered in the forum, alternately, weeping for their dead and raging against the leaders who had led so many Romans to their deaths. Some citizens began preparing to flee the city, convinced that Hannibal would soon appear at Rome's gates with his victorious army. Others spoke of surrender, arguing that further resistance would only lead to more catastrophic defeats. Yet in this moment of supreme crisis, The Roman character revealed the qualities that had enabled their rise to power and would ultimately ensure their survival. Let your consciousness drift peacefully as we witness how Rome's leaders and people responded to existential threat not with despair, but with grim determination to continue the struggle regardless of cost. The Senate, led by senior statesmen who had lived through previous crises, refused to consider surrender or negotiate with the Carthaginian invader. Instead, they immediately began raising new armies for whatever manpower remained available. Slaves were offered freedom in exchange for military service. Debtors were released from prison to join the legions, and boys barely old enough to carry weapons were enlisted in Rome's desperate fight for survival. More remarkably, when Carthaginian envoys arrived in Rome to negotiate the ransom of Roman prisoners taken at Cannae, the Senate refused even to meet with them. The message was clear. Rome would not acknowledge defeat or give Hannibal the legitimacy that such negotiations would imply. The war would continue, regardless of how many more disasters might follow. Feel yourself sinking deeper into restful sleep as we witness one of history's most fateful decisions. After his overwhelming victory at Cannae, Hannibal faced a strategic choice that would ultimately determine the outcome of the entire war. His cavalry commander, Hannibal, urged him to march immediately on Rome itself, arguing that the city was defenseless and that victory could be achieved within days. But Hannibal hesitated. His army, though victorious, had suffered casualties and was tired from the intense fighting. More importantly, he lacked the siege equipment necessary to capture a strongly fortified city like Rome, and his supply lines were already stretched thin. Instead of pressing his advantage, he chose to consolidate his gains in southern Italy, hoping that his victory would persuade more Roman allies to join his cause, and that Rome itself would eventually seek peace terms. This moment of hesitation would later be called Hannibal's greatest mistake, though few military historians fault his reasoning at the time. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we witness how this single decision shaped the entire course of the Second Punic War, and ultimately the fate of both Rome and Carthage. Hannibal's famous words to his commander, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one," would echo through history as one of the great what-ifs of the ancient world. Had Hannibal marched on Rome immediately after Cannae, he might have found the city's defenses in chaos and its population demoralized beyond resistance. Instead, his pause gave Rome the precious time it needed to recover from the shock of defeat and prepare for the long struggle ahead. Rest peacefully as we explore how Rome used this breathing space to demonstrate the remarkable resilience that had carried it through previous crises. The city's leaders, rather than wallowing in despair, immediately began implementing emergency measures that would transform the nature of the war itself. The most crucial decision was to avoid any further pitched battles with Hannibal's army. The lessons of Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae had finally convinced even the most aggressive Roman commanders that traditional tactics were useless against Carthaginian tactical genius. Instead, Rome would return to Fabian strategy, but implement it on a scale never before attempted. Let your mind drift peacefully as we witness Rome's transformation into a military state organized around a single goal: the defeat of Hannibal through attrition and endurance rather than brilliant tactical victories. New armies were raised not to seek decisive battles, but to contain Carthaginian movements, protect loyal cities, and gradually strangle Hannibal's supply lines. More importantly, Rome began to implement a grand strategy that would eventually prove decisive. While defensive armies in Italy focused on containing Hannibal, Roman forces would open new fronts in Spain and Africa, attacking Carthaginian territories and forcing Carthage to divide its resources. This global approach to warfare was unprecedented in ancient history and would become a model for later empires. The immediate challenge, however, remained Hannibal's presence in Italy and the growing defection of Roman allies. Feel yourself sinking deeper into tranquil rest as we follow the Carthaginian general's efforts to expand his coalition of Italian supporters following his victory at Cannae. Hannibal's greatest success came with the defection of Capua, the largest and wealthiest city in southern Italy after Rome itself. Capua's decision to join the Carthaginian cause was a devastating blow to Roman prestige and a significant boost to Hannibal's strategic position. The city's resources, manpower, and strategic location provided exactly the kind of secure base that Hannibal needed to sustain his army in hostile territory. Other cities followed Capua's example, particularly in southern Italy, where Greek cultural influences had always made the population somewhat ambivalent about Roman rule. Tarentum, with its excellent harbor, provided Hannibal with a potential link to Carthaginian naval forces and reinforcements from North Africa. Syracuse and Sicily also defected, opening a new theater of operations that further stretched Roman resources. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we witness Hannibal's efforts to exploit these successes during the years following Cannae. The Carthaginian general established winter quarters in Capua, allowing his army to rest and refit in comfort while he planned campaigns for the following year. His soldiers, after years of constant marching and fighting, finally had secure bases where they could recover their strength and replace worn equipment. But these comfortable quarters also created unexpected problems for Hannibal's army. Rest peacefully as we explore how the luxuries of Capua began to soften the edge of soldiers who had been hardened by years of campaign. Roman writers would later claim that the delights of Capua, its warm baths, fine wines, and willing women, corrupted Carthaginian military discipline and weakened their fighting effectiveness. While this assessment was probably exaggerated by Roman propaganda, there was some truth to the observation that extended periods in comfortable quarters could affect military readiness. More significantly, the dispersion of Carthaginian forces among various Italian cities made it difficult for Hannibal to concentrate his army for major operations while simultaneously defending his new allies against inevitable Roman counterattacks. Let your consciousness drift peacefully as we witness Rome's patient but relentless response to these new challenges. Rather than attempting to retake defected cities immediately, Roman strategy focused on isolating them from mutual support and gradually wearing down their resistance. Through siege warfare and economic pressure, the siege of Capua became the centerpiece of this strategy. Roman forces surrounded the city with elaborate fortifications, creating both an inner wall to prevent sorties by the defenders and an outer wall to protect the besiegers from Hannibal's relief attempts. This double wall system, reminiscent of later Roman siege techniques at Alesia, allowed Roman forces to maintain their blockade even when Hannibal himself arrived with his main army. Feel yourself sinking deeper into restful sleep as we witness one of Hannibal's most desperate attempts to break the siege of his most important ally. Unable to penetrate the Roman siege, works through direct assault. The Carthaginian general attempted a psychological masterstroke. He marched his army directly toward Rome itself, hoping that the threat to their capital would force the Romans to abandon their siege of Capua. The march on Rome represented one of Hannibal's most audacious gambles, and for a few terrifying days, it seemed as if it might succeed. Allow yourself to drift peacefully as we witness the panic that gripped the Roman capital when scouts reported that Carthaginian cavalry had been seen just miles from the city walls. For the first time since the Gallic sack centuries earlier, an enemy army was approaching Rome itself. The city's population, swollen by refugees from the countryside, watched in terror as distant dust clouds marked Hannibal's advance. Emergency preparations began immediately. The walls were manned by whatever troops remained in the city, while civilians prepared to defend their homes with whatever weapons they could find. But Hannibal's demonstration before Rome dramatic. Though it was, ultimately revealed the limitations of his strategic position rather than his strength. Rest peacefully as we witness how the Romans, despite their fear, maintained their discipline and refused to be drawn into the trap that Hannibal had set for them. The siege of Capua continued even as Hannibal's main army appeared before Rome's gates. Roman commanders understood that their enemy's march on the capital was essentially a bluff. Hannibal lacked the siege equipment necessary to take a strongly fortified city by storm, and his army could not maintain itself indefinitely in the devastated countryside around Rome without secure supply lines. Feel yourself sinking deeper into tranquil rest as we follow Hannibal's frustrated retreat from Rome after only a few days of ineffective demonstrations. The psychological impact of his presence had been considerable, but it had achieved nothing concrete. Capua remained under siege. His other Italian allies were still isolated from mutual support, and his army had accomplished nothing more than a dramatic gesture that cost precious time and resources. More ominously for the Carthaginian cause, Hannibal's march on Rome had demonstrated to Italian observers that even his legendary army could not achieve decisive results against determined Roman resistance. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded him since Cannae began to fade as it became apparent that spectacular tactical victories did not necessarily translate into strategic success. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we witness the gradual erosion of Hannibal's position throughout Italy during the years following his failed march on Rome. One by one, his Italian allies found themselves under increasing pressure from Roman forces that no longer feared to engage Carthaginian armies in the kind of limited actions that Rome could afford to lose. The fall of Capua in 211 BCE marked a crucial turning point in the war. Despite Hannibal's desperate attempts to relieve the siege, the city's defenders were finally starved into submission after 2 years of blockade. The Roman revenge was terrible. The city's leaders were executed, its population sold into slavery, and its territory confiscated as punishment for betraying Rome. Allow your consciousness to drift peacefully as we witness how the recapture of Capua sent a clear message throughout Italy about the ultimate fate of cities that chose to abandon Roman alliance. The harsh treatment of Capua's population served both as revenge for their betrayal and as a warning to other potential defectors that Roman memory was long and Roman vengeance was certain. More significantly, the fall of Capua deprived Hannibal of his most important base in Italy. His army was once again forced to live as wandering invaders, constantly seeking supplies and shelter in an increasingly hostile countryside. The comfortable winter quarters that had allowed his soldiers to rest and refit were no longer available, and the strain of continuous campaigning began to tell on even his most veteran troops. Rest peacefully as we witness the broader transformation of the Second Punic War during these crucial years. While Hannibal remained dangerous in Italy, the focus of the conflict was gradually shifting to other theaters where Rome's advantages in resources and organization could be brought to bear more effectively. In Spain, a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same man whose father had been wounded fighting Hannibal at the Ticinus River years earlier, was achieving remarkable successes against Carthaginian forces. Scipio had learned valuable lessons from studying Hannibal's tactical methods, and he was now applying similar principles of flexibility and innovation to his own campaigns. Feel yourself sinking deeper into restful sleep as we follow Scipio's brilliant campaign that would ultimately deprive Carthage of its Spanish Empire and the resources that sustained Hannibal's army in Italy. The young Roman general had inherited his father's command after both his father and uncle were killed fighting in Spain, and he was determined to succeed where they had failed. Scipio's masterpiece was the capture of New Carthage, Carthage's main base in Spain, through a combined land and sea assault that demonstrated tactical brilliance worthy of Hannibal himself. The city's fall not only eliminated Carthaginian power in eastern Spain, but also provided Rome with enormous quantities of gold, silver, and military supplies that had been accumulating there for years. More importantly, Scipio's victory at knew. Carthage was followed by a series of battles that systematically destroyed Carthaginian armies in Spain and forced their commanders to abandon the peninsula entirely. By 206 BCE, Carthaginian power in Spain had been completely eliminated, depriving Hannibal of the reinforcements and supplies he desperately needed to continue his campaign in Italy. Allow your mind to drift peacefully through these distant battlefields as we witness how Rome's global strategy was finally beginning to achieve decisive results. While Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy, his strategic position was becoming increasingly untenable as Roman forces attacked Carthaginian interests throughout the Mediterranean world. The isolation of Hannibal in Italy was becoming more complete with each passing year. Let your consciousness drift peacefully as we witness how the great Carthaginian general, once the terror of Rome, found himself increasingly trapped in the southern Italian peninsula with no hope of reinforcement or resupply from his homeland. The final blow to Hannibal's hopes came when his brother Hasdrubal, who had been fighting Roman forces in Spain, finally managed to cross the Alps with a relief army intended to join forces with Hannibal in Italy. After years of separation, the two brothers were finally in position to combine their armies and perhaps achieve the decisive victory that had eluded Hannibal since Cannae. But Roman intelligence networks had been tracking Hasdrubal's movements, and Roman armies moved swiftly to intercept him before he could unite with his brother's forces. Feel yourself sinking deeper into restful sleep as we witness the Battle of the Meteorus River in 207 BCE, where Roman forces under Gaius Claudius Nero achieved a victory that would prove decisive to the entire war. Hasdrubal fought bravely, but his army, exhausted from the Alpine crossing and unfamiliar with Italian terrain, could not match the disciplined Roman legions who had learned much about warfare during their long struggle with Hannibal. The Carthaginian relief army was destroyed, and Hasdrubal himself died fighting in the front ranks rather than survive such a catastrophic defeat. The news of his brother's death reached Hannibal in a manner both brutal and unmistakably Roman. Rest peacefully as we witness how Roman cavalry rode up to Hannibal's camp and hurled Hasdrubal's severed head over the walls, a grim message that his last hope of reinforcement had died with his brother. This moment marked the effective end of Hannibal's campaign in Italy, though he would remain there for several more years. With no possibility of reinforcement, and his Italian allies increasingly abandoning his cause, the great general found himself reduced to essentially defensive operations, holding territory in the far south, while Roman forces gradually tightened their grip on the rest of the peninsula. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we witness the final phase of this epic struggle, shifting from Italy to North Africa itself. Scipio, having completed his conquest of Spain, convinced the Roman Senate to authorize a direct invasion of Carthaginian territory. This bold strategy would force Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend their homeland, finally ending the threat that had terrorized Rome for over 15 years. The invasion of Africa in 204 BCE demonstrated how completely the strategic situation had changed since the early years of the war. Roman armies, once terrified of facing Carthaginian forces, now moved confidently into enemy territory, employing the same tactical innovations and strategic flexibility that Hannibal had once used against them. Scipio's success in Africa was rapid and dramatic. Let your mind drift peacefully as we witness how the young Roman general formed alliances with Carthaginian enemies, particularly the Numidian cavalry that had once been Hannibal's most effective weapon. By turning Carthage's own allies against them, Scipio was employing the same divide-and-conquer strategies that had served Rome so well in its conquest of Italy. The threat to Carthage itself finally forced the Carthaginian government to make the painful decision that Hannibal had long expected. After 16 years in Italy, the greatest general of the ancient world received orders to abandon his campaign and return home to defend the city that had sent him on his impossible mission. So many years before, feel yourself sinking deeper into tranquil rest as we witness Hannibal's final departure from Italian soil. The general who had crossed the Alps with elephants, who had destroyed 3 Roman armies in as many years, who had terrorized Rome itself with his presence, now sailed away from the land where he had achieved immortal fame but ultimate failure. Meeting between Hannibal and Scipio near the town of Zama in 202 BCE represented far more than a battle between 2 armies. It was a confrontation between the greatest generals of their age, representatives of 2 civilizations locked in a struggle that would determine the future of the Mediterranean world. Allow your consciousness to drift peacefully as we witness the preliminary negotiations between these 2 legendary commanders. According to ancient sources, Hannibal and Scipio met privately before the battle to attempt one final diplomatic solution to their long conflict. Both men understood that the coming battle would likely end the war forever, and both sought to gauge their opponent's character and intentions. The conversation revealed the profound respect that these enemies held for each other. Hannibal, now in his mid-40s and graying from decades of constant warfare, acknowledged Scipio's achievements and offered terms for peace that would have left Carthage as a client state of Rome but preserved its independence. Scipio, barely 30 years old but already seasoned by years of command, listened respectfully but ultimately rejected any compromise that would allow Carthage to remain a potential threat to Roman security. Rest peacefully as we approach the climactic battle that would end one of history's greatest conflicts. The Battle of Zama represented not just a clash between Roman and Carthaginian armies, but a test of everything both sides had learned during nearly 2 decades of warfare. Hannibal's army at Zama was a shadow of the force that had terrorized Italy for so many years. His Italian veterans were few in number, and most of his troops were hastily recruited Carthaginian militia and unreliable mercenaries. Most crucially, his famous cavalry advantage had been lost. The Numidian horsemen, who had won him so many victories, now fought for Rome under Scipio's command. Scipio, by contrast, commanded an army that represented everything Rome had learned during its long struggle with Carthaginian tactical genius. Feel yourself sinking deeper into peaceful rest as we witness how the young Roman general had studied every aspect of Hannibal's methods and adapted them to Roman strengths while compensating for Roman weaknesses. The Roman army at Zama was organized with unprecedented flexibility, abandoning the rigid formations that had served Rome well in traditional warfare but had proven so vulnerable to Hannibal's tactical innovations. Scipio arranged his legions in 3 lines, but with gaps between the maniples that would allow Hannibal's war elephants to pass through harmlessly rather than disrupting Roman formations. Most importantly, Scipio had secured the services of Massinissa, the Numidian king whose cavalry had once served Carthage, but who now saw greater advantage in alliance with Rome. These African horsemen brought to the Roman side the same mobility and tactical skill that had made Hannibal's victories possible, while Carthaginian forces found themselves facing battle without their traditional advantages. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we witness the opening moments of this climactic battle on October 19, 202 BCE. Hannibal opened with his traditional elephant charge, hoping that these massive beasts might disrupt Roman formations as they had done in previous battles. But Scipio's preparations proved devastatingly effective. The war elephants, panicked by Roman trumpets and javelins, either passed harmlessly through the gaps in Roman lines or turned back upon their own forces. The failure of the elephant charge was followed by a general advance of Carthaginian infantry, but without cavalry support, and facing an enemy that had learned to counter traditional Carthaginian tactics. Hannibal found himself fighting the kind of straightforward battle that favored Roman strengths rather than Carthaginian innovations. Rest peacefully as we witness the decisive moment when Masiniss's Numidian cavalry, having routed their Carthaginian counterparts, swept around behind Hannibal's army to attack from the rear. The great general who had perfected the art of encirclement at Cannae now found his own forces trapped in the same kind of tactical vice that he had used so effectively against Roman armies. The Battle of Zama ended with complete Carthaginian defeat. Hannibal's army was destroyed, and the general himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing the battlefield with a small escort of cavalry. For the first time in his career, the master tactician had been decisively outfought by an opponent who had learned his methods and surpassed them. Feel yourself drifting peacefully as we witness the end of the Second Punic War and the beginning of Rome's transformation into the dominant power of the ancient world. The peace treaty that followed Zama was harsh, but not vindictive. Carthage would survive as an independent city-state, but its empire was dismantled, its navy destroyed, and its ability to wage war severely restricted. More significantly, the victory at Zama established Rome as the premier military power in the Mediterranean world. The republic that had once struggled to control central Italy now commanded territories from Spain to Syria, and its legions were recognized as the finest fighting force in the ancient world. The lessons learned in the crucible of war against Hannibal had forged Roman military methods that would conquer most of the known world within the next 2 centuries. Let your consciousness drift peacefully through the decades that followed Rome's victory over Carthage. The immediate aftermath of the war saw tremendous changes in Roman society as the Republic struggled to adapt to its new role as a Mediterranean superpower. The wealth that flowed into Rome from conquered territories transformed the city from a modest Italian town into a magnificent capital worthy of a world empire. But success brought new challenges that would ultimately prove more dangerous to Roman survival than any external enemy. Allow your mind to wander peacefully as we explore how victory over Carthage created internal pressures that would eventually tear the Roman Republic apart from within. The most immediate change was economic. The vast wealth gained from conquering Carthaginian territories, combined with tribute from new provinces and booty from subsequent wars, created unprecedented prosperity for some Romans, while devastating the traditional agricultural economy that had supported the Republic's citizen soldiers, small farmers, who had formed the backbone of Roman armies for centuries, found themselves unable to compete with slave-worked plantations that produced grain more cheaply than free citizens could afford. Many sold their ancestral lands and migrated to Rome itself, where they became part of an increasingly restless urban population dependent on government subsidies for survival. Rest peacefully as we witness how the transformation of Roman society accelerated during the 2nd century BCE. The traditional Roman values of simplicity, discipline, and civic duty began to erode as contact with the sophisticated cultures of Greece and the East exposed Romans to new ideas about philosophy, art, and luxury that challenged their ancestral customs. The influx of Greek slaves, many of them highly educated, brought new learning to Roman households, but also introduced foreign concepts that conservative Romans viewed with suspicion. Greek philosophy, with its emphasis on individual fulfillment and intellectual inquiry, seemed to conflict with traditional Roman emphasis on duty to family and state. Greek art and literature, with their celebration of human achievement and beauty, appeared decadent to Romans raised on stories of Cincinnatus leaving his plow to serve as dictator. Feel yourself sinking deeper into tranquil rest as we follow the gradual emergence of a new Roman aristocracy whose wealth and power dwarfed anything the early republic had known. Successful generals returned from conquered territories with enormous fortunes in gold, silver, and slaves, while provincial governors discovered that their positions offered unprecedented opportunities for personal enrichment through taxation. And tribute collection the gap between rich and poor, which had existed but remained manageable in earlier centuries, now became a chasm that threatened the social cohesion upon which republican government depended. Wealthy Romans built palatial homes on the Palatine Hill, decorated with Greek art and staffed by hundreds of educated slaves, while poor citizens crowded into multi-story tenements where entire families lived in single rooms without adequate sanitation or fire protection. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen as we witness the emergence of the first serious challenges to traditional Roman political order. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, members of one of Rome's most distinguished families, attempted to address growing social inequality through land redistribution programs that would provide small farms for landless citizens. The Gracchi, as they became known, represented a new type of Roman politician who appealed directly to popular assemblies rather than working through traditional senatorial channels. Their proposals to redistribute public land from wealthy estates to poor citizens struck at the heart of aristocratic power and provoked violent opposition from senators, who saw such measures as threats to their accumulated wealth and influence. Your mind drift peacefully through the turbulent decade of the 130s and 120s BCE as we witness the first serious breakdown of Roman political norms. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, pushed through his land redistribution law by bypassing senatorial opposition and appealing directly to popular votes. When he sought re-election in violation of traditional term limits, conservative senators led a mob that killed him and 300 of his supporters in the first serious political violence Rome had experienced in centuries, the death of Tiberius. Gracchus marked a turning point in Roman history, demonstrating that the constitutional traditions that had guided the Republic for centuries could be swept aside when fundamental interests were at stake. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius attempted to continue his work, but met an even more violent end when senatorial forces killed him and 3,000 of his followers in what amounted to civil warfare in Rome's streets. Rest peacefully as we witness how the violence that destroyed the Gracchi established precedents that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic itself. Political competition, which had previously been conducted within accepted constitutional boundaries, now increasingly involved threats of violence and appeals to mob action. The Roman political system, designed for a small city-state where all citizens knew each other personally, proved inadequate for governing a world empire with all its competing interests and enormous wealth. The crisis of the Gracchi was followed by even more serious threats to Roman stability. Feel yourself sinking deeper into tranquil rest as we witness the emergence of Gaius Marius, a military genius whose reforms transformed Roman armies but also created new dangers for republican government. Marius solved Rome's recruitment crisis by abandoning the traditional requirement that soldiers provide their own equipment and opening military service to landless citizens who would be equipped at state expense. These new professional soldiers served for decades rather than single campaigns, developing intense loyalty to successful commanders who could provide them with regular pay, shares of booty, and land grants upon retirement. The Marian military reforms created armies that were more effective than any Rome had previously fielded, but they also fundamentally altered the relationship between soldiers and the state. Allow your consciousness to drift peacefully as we explore how these professional legions became personal instruments of ambitious generals rather than servants of the Roman people. The new system's dangers became apparent during the Social War of 9188 BCE, when Rome's Italian allies finally demanded the full citizenship that had been promised but never granted. This conflict, fought between Romans and their former allies throughout the Italian peninsula, demonstrated how easily Roman Armies could be turned against Roman interests when commanded by ambitious leaders pursuing personal agendas. The social war's resolution, through the gradual extension of Roman citizenship to all Italians, seemed to restore stability, but it had actually accelerated the Republic's transformation into something its founders would not have recognized. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we witness how the stage was now set for the emergence of the great strongmen who would dominate Rome's final century as a republic. The first of these figures was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a conservative aristocrat, who used his military command against King Mithridates of Pontus to build a personal army loyal to him rather than to the Roman state. When political enemies in Rome attempted to replace him with Marius, Sulla made the unprecedented decision to march his legions on Rome itself, capturing the city by force and demonstrating that Roman armies could be used against Roman citizens. Feel yourself sinking deeper into peaceful rest as we witness Sulla's dictatorship and prescriptions, where thousands of Romans were declared enemies of the state and killed, their properties confiscated to reward Sulla's supporters. This systematic use of state terror to eliminate political opposition established precedents that would haunt Rome for generations to come. After Sulla's retirement and death, new strongmen emerged to fill the power vacuum he had created. Pompey the Great conquered the East, bringing enormous wealth to Rome while building a military reputation that rivaled the greatest generals of the past. Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, extending Roman power to the Atlantic Ocean while accumulating the resources and veteran loyalty that would make him Pompey's equal. Allow your mind to drift peacefully as we witness the formation and breakdown of the First Triumvirate, the secret alliance between Pompey, Caesar, and Marcus Crassus that effectively ruled Rome through backroom deals rather than constitutional processes. When Crassus died fighting the Parthians in rivalry between Pompey and Caesar became irreconcilable, civil war became inevitable. Rest peacefully as we follow Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, the point of no return that transformed him from Rome's most successful general into an enemy of the state. The civil war that followed saw Roman legions fighting Roman legions across the Mediterranean world, from Spain to Egypt, in a conflict that would determine whether Rome remained a republic or became a monarchy in all but name. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus and his subsequent dictatorship represented the effective end of the Roman Republic, though few contemporaries understood the permanence of this transformation. Let your consciousness drift peacefully as we witness Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, and the final civil wars that would determine Rome's ultimate destiny. The emergence of Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and his eventual transformation into Augustus, Rome's first emperor, marked the beginning of the imperial period that would endure for over 4 centuries in the West and 1,000 years in the East. Feel yourself sinking into deeper tranquility as we follow the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that brought stability and prosperity to the Mediterranean world under imperial rule. Under the emperors, Rome reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. Roman law, Roman engineering, and Roman culture spread throughout this vast empire, creating a common civilization that would influence human development for millennia to come. Allow your breathing to slow as we witness the golden age of Roman literature under Augustus, the architectural marvels of the Flavian emperors, and the legal codifications that would become the foundation of Western jurisprudence. Yet even at its height, the empire contained the seeds of its eventual decline. Rest peacefully as we follow the gradual transformation of the Roman world during the 3rd century crisis, when internal rebellion, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse nearly destroyed the empire entirely. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine restored stability temporarily, but at the cost of transforming Rome into an entirely different kind of state, an autocratic, bureaucratic empire more resembling the eastern kingdoms Rome had once conquered, than the republic that had conquered them. Feel yourself drifting into deeper rest as we witness the final centuries of Roman decline. As barbarian tribes settled within Roman borders, emperors became puppets of Germanic warlords, and the great cities that had once symbolized Roman power gradually emptied as trade and commerce collapsed. The fall of Rome was not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual process that unfolded over centuries. Let your mind wander peacefully through these twilight years as Germanic kingdoms emerged within former Roman territories, preserving fragments of Roman law and culture while adapting them to new circumstances. When the last Western Roman emperor was deposed in 476 CE, the event passed almost unnoticed by contemporaries who had long grown accustomed to Germanic rulers exercising real power while Roman titles became merely ceremonial. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, would continue for another 1,000 years, but the Rome of Caesar and Augustus had vanished forever. Allow yourself to sink into complete tranquility as we reflect on this epic journey from a collection of hilltop villages to the greatest empire the world had ever known, and ultimately to the quiet end of a civilization that had shaped human history for over a millennium. The rise and fall of Rome demonstrates both the heights that human organization and determination can achieve, and the ultimate fragility of even the mightiest civilizations. Don't let the lessons of Roman history carry you into peaceful sleep. The importance of civic virtue, the dangers of unchecked ambition, the power of legal institutions, and the eternal human struggle between order and freedom that Rome embodied throughout its long existence. In Rome's story, we see reflected our own challenges and possibilities, reminding us that history is not merely a record of the past, but a guide for understanding the present and shaping the future. Sleep now, with the complete story of Rome's rise and fall echoing gently in your dreams, a testament to the grandeur and tragedy of human civilization itself.